New Haven was a colony on the edge of humanity's reach, a place where hope and fear mingled like oil and water. It wasn't much to look at: rows of prefabricated buildings, dusty streets, and the constant hum of machinery working overtime to keep life sustainable. But it was home to thousands of people who had fled Earth in search of something better. Among them were soldiers, scientists, engineers, and families, all trying to carve out a future under an alien sun. For Clara Hayes, New Haven was just another stop along her quiet journey through life. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't command attention or demand respect. Instead, she blended into the background like a shadow, unnoticed but always present. Her days were spent in the archive department of the colony's administrative center, cataloging reports, organizing data, and writing memos that no one seemed to read. To most people, she was invisible, a nameless face behind a desk stacked high with papers. Clara didn't mind being overlooked. In fact, she preferred it that way. Growing up, she'd learned early on that staying quiet kept you safe. People tended to leave you alone when they thought you weren't worth noticing. And so, she went about her work without complaint, happy to stay out of the spotlight while others took center stage. But there was more to Clara than anyone realized. Beneath her calm exterior lay a sharp mind, one that absorbed information like a sponge. She had a knack for patterns, for seeing connections between seemingly unrelated events. When she read reports about skirmishes with the Varn, an aggressive alien species that had been encroaching on human territory, she couldn't help but analyze them, picking apart every detail until she understood what went wrong and how it could have been avoided. The Varn were a formidable enemy. Tall, insect-like creatures with razor-sharp claws and an uncanny ability to adapt to any situation, they struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest soldiers. Their attacks were swift and brutal, leaving little room for error. Every battle was a gamble, and humanity was losing more often than not. Colonel Jameson, the head of operations at New Haven, was well aware of this fact. He paced back and forth in his office late at night, poring over maps and reports, searching for some kind of solution. His brow furrowed as he muttered curses under his breath. "We're running out of time," he said aloud, though no one was there to hear him. "If we don't figure something out soon, we're done for." What Colonel Jameson didn't know was that someone else was thinking the same thing. Clara sat at her desk in the archives, surrounded by stacks of documents. Her eyes scanned page after page, absorbing every word. She wasn't just reading for fun. She was piecing together a puzzle, one fragment at a time. Slowly but surely, a picture was forming in her mind. A plan, a strategy, a way to fight back against the Varn. It wasn't easy. The Varn were unlike anything humanity had faced before. They moved differently, fought differently, and thought differently. Traditional military tactics wouldn't work against them. But Clara believed that if she could learn their patterns, if she could anticipate their moves, she might be able to turn the tide. One day, during a routine meeting with Colonel Jameson, Clara decided to speak up. It wasn't something she did often, but the stakes were too high to stay silent. "Sir," she began hesitantly, clutching a folder tightly in her hands, "I've been reviewing some of the recent reports, and I think I may have found a way to improve our supply chain logistics." Colonel Jameson looked up from his desk, surprised to hear her voice. He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Supply chain logistics? That's hardly my top priority right now, Miss Hayes." "I understand, sir," Clara replied quickly, her cheeks flushing red. "But if we can streamline our deliveries and reduce delays, it could give us an advantage in the field. For example," she hesitated, then plunged ahead, "if we reroute shipments through Sector B instead of Sector A, we could avoid areas where the Varn are most active." Jameson listened politely, nodding occasionally, but it was clear he wasn't convinced. After a few moments, he cut her off mid-sentence. "Thank you for your input, Miss Hayes, but I'm afraid we need to focus on more immediate concerns." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, turning his attention back to the map spread out before him. Clara left the office feeling deflated but not defeated. She knew her idea was sound. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Still, she couldn't shake the frustration of being ignored. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and it probably wouldn't be the last. No matter how hard she tried, No one seemed willing to listen. Back in the archives, Clara returned to her work with renewed determination. If they wouldn't hear her out, then she would find another way to make her voice heard. Late into the night, long after everyone else had gone home, she sat at her desk, scribbling notes and sketching diagrams. She poured everything she had into creating a comprehensive manual, a guide to surviving and thriving in a war against the Varn, drawing inspiration from Earth's history. She studied battles fought centuries ago, analyzing strategies used by generals like Sun Tzu and Napoleon. She combined these lessons with insights gleaned from recent conflicts, tailoring her advice specifically to the challenges posed by the Varn. Each section of the manual addressed a different aspect of warfare: reconnaissance, resource management, psychological tactics, and more. As the weeks passed, Clara's confidence grew. She knew she was onto something important, something that could change the course of the war. But she also knew that sharing it openly would be risky. The military hierarchy was rigid, and ideas from someone like her, a lowly archivist with no formal combat training, would likely be dismissed outright. So she kept working in secret, refining her manual bit by bit. By day, she continued her duties in the archives, keeping her head down and avoiding attention. By night, she worked tirelessly on her project, determined to finish before it was too late. Little did Clara know, her quiet dedication was about to set off a chain reaction that would ripple through the entire colony and beyond. For now, though, she remained content to labor in obscurity, trusting that her efforts would eventually pay off, because deep down, she believed in one simple truth. Sometimes, the quietest voices carry the loudest messages, and maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. The colony of New Haven was crumbling under the weight of constant attacks. The Varn, with their relentless assaults and unparalleled adaptability, had pushed humanity to its limits. Every day brought fresh horrors: burned-out outposts, shattered supply lines, and mounting casualties. Fear hung heavy in the air, a suffocating cloud that clung to everyone who called this place home. Clara Hayes watched it all unfold from her quiet corner in the archives. She saw the reports come in, one after another, detailing losses that seemed impossible to recover from. Each document told the same grim story: failure to anticipate the Varn's movements, failure to protect vulnerable settlements, failure to hold the line against an enemy that refused to back down. Despite the chaos swirling around her, Clara kept working on her manual. It had become more than just a project. It was her lifeline, her way of coping with the despair that threatened to consume her. Late into the night, she pored over maps and battle logs, searching for patterns, hunting for solutions. Her desk was cluttered with notes and diagrams, each page filled with scribbles and arrows pointing toward strategies she hoped would make a difference. But no matter how many hours she spent refining her ideas, doubt lingered in the back of her mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if her plans were too theoretical, too detached from the brutal reality of war? And even if they worked, who would listen to someone like her? A nobody, a face in the crowd? Her fears weren't unfounded. The military leadership at New Haven was in disarray. Officers bickered endlessly during meetings, blaming each other for every setback. Colonel Jameson, once a pillar of strength, now looked haggard and defeated. His confidence wavered as defeat piled upon defeat, and his decisions grew increasingly erratic. Morale among the troops plummeted, leaving soldiers questioning whether victory was even possible. One evening, as Clara sorted through yet another stack of casualty reports, she heard raised voices coming from the hallway outside the archives. Curious, she stepped closer to the door and listened. Two lieutenants, Daniel Harper and Rachel Meyer, were arguing heatedly about the latest mission gone wrong. "We can't keep doing this," Lieutenant Harper snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. "Every time we send our people out there, they get slaughtered. We're throwing lives away for nothing." Lieutenant Daniel Harper stormed down the dimly lit hallway, his boots echoing against the cold metal floor. His face was flushed with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't shake the frustration of another failed mission, another group of soldiers lost to the Varn's cunning tactics. It felt like they were fighting blindfolded, stumbling from one disaster to the next without any real plan. As he passed the archives, Something caught his eye. A thin stack of papers sitting on a small table just inside the doorway. Curious, he stopped and picked them up. At first glance, the documents looked ordinary enough. Typed pages filled with bullet points and diagrams. But as Daniel began to read, his irritation gave way to astonishment. The manual, titled simply A Guide to Victory, was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It wasn't flashy or overly complicated. Instead, it was clear, concise, and brutally practical. Each section tackled a specific problem the colony faced in its war against the Varn. There were strategies for ambushes, tips for conserving resources, even advice on how to predict the Varn's movements based on their behavior patterns. Whoever had written this knew exactly what they were talking about. Daniel flipped through the pages quickly, his heart racing. This wasn't just some half-baked idea scribbled by an overeager recruit. It was a masterpiece. Whoever wrote it had done their homework, studying every detail of the conflict and crafting solutions that made perfect sense. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. He tucked the manual under his arm and hurried back to his quarters. Sitting at his desk, he read it again, this time more carefully. By the time he finished, he was convinced. If they followed these strategies, they might actually stand a chance. But who could have written it? And why hadn't they come forward? The next morning, Daniel brought the manual to a meeting with Colonel Jameson and several other officers. "I found this last night," he said, placing the document on the table. I think it'd change everything." Colonel Jameson raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. He picked up the manual and began reading. The room fell silent as the others gathered around, each person growing more intrigued with every page. Even Jameson, who had grown skeptical of almost everything lately, seemed impressed. "This is brilliant," Lieutenant Meyer murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. "Whoever wrote this knows the Varn better than we do." "But who is it?" asked Captain Lewis, frowning. "And why would they leave it lying around instead of coming to us directly?" No one had an answer. Speculation ran wild. Some thought it might be the work of a rogue AI analyzing data in secret, while others wondered if it came from an anonymous source on Earth. Regardless of its origins, one thing was clear. They needed to put to use. Over the following days, the strategies outlined in the manual began to take shape. Troops started implementing new ambush techniques, using decoys to lure the Varn into traps. Supply routes were rerouted to avoid areas where the aliens were most active. Communication protocols were tightened to prevent leaks that might give away their plans. Slowly but surely, things began to improve. The first sign of success came when a patrol unit managed to repel a surprise attack by the Varn. Using tactics straight out of the manual, they set up defensive positions that forced the enemy to retreat with heavy losses. News of the victory spread quickly, boosting morale across the colony. For the first time in months, people dared to believe that they might actually win this war. But while the rest of the colony celebrated, Clara Hayes watched in the shadows, her emotions a tangled mess. She wanted to feel proud of what she'd accomplished, but fear kept her rooted in place. Every time someone mentioned the manual, her stomach twisted into knots. What if they figured out it was her? What if they realized the author was just a lowly archivist with no business meddling in military affairs? Her paranoia grew worse as whispers about the mysterious writer reached her ears. People speculated endlessly, debating whether it was a seasoned general, a brilliant scientist, or even an alien sympathizer feeding false information. Some suggested it might be a collective effort, crafted by a team of experts working behind the scenes. No one suspected the quiet woman in the archives. Still, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She noticed subtle changes in how her co-workers treated her, lingering glances, awkward pauses in conversation, questions about what she did during her free time. At first, she told herself she was imagining things, but the signs became harder to ignore. One afternoon, as she was leaving the archives, Lieutenant Harper approached her. Daniel had been curious about the manual since the moment he'd found it, and now he had a hunch. Something about Clara struck him as different, not in an obvious way, but in the quiet confidence she carried herself with. He decided to test his theory. "Miss Hayes," he said, stepping into her path, "do you have a moment?" Clara froze, her pulse quickening. "Yes, Lieutenant," she replied cautiously, clutching her folder tightly to her chest. "I've been meaning to ask. You wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you?" He held up a copy of the manual, his eyes searching hers for any hint of recognition. Clara's throat went dry. She opened her mouth to deny it, but before she could speak, Daniel continued. "Look, I'm not accusing you of anything. I think whoever wrote this deserves credit. These ideas are saving lives." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Her mind raced, weighing the risks of admitting the truth versus continuing to live in silence. Finally, she sighed and looked down at the floor. "What if I did write it?" she whispered, so softly that Daniel almost missed it. Daniel blinked, surprised by how easily she confessed. "You did?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Clara hesitated, then shrugged. "Because no one would listen. You saw how Colonel Jameson reacted when I tried to share my thoughts before. I'm just me. Nobody pays attention to people like me." Daniel frowned, guilt settling in his chest. He thought back to all the times he dismissed her suggestions during meetings, assuming they weren't worth considering. Now he realized how wrong he'd been. "Clara," he said gently, "this isn't just good, it's extraordinary. We need your help. Will you let us use your ideas officially?" Clara hesitated again, torn between her desire to stay hidden and her longing to make a difference. Eventually, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly, "but I don't want anyone to know it's me. Please." Daniel promised to keep her secret safe, though he knew it wouldn't be easy. He arranged for Clara to attend strategy sessions, allowing her to contribute anonymously. She sat in the back of the room, speaking only when necessary, her presence barely acknowledged. Yet her insights proved invaluable, turning minor victories into major breakthroughs. Under Clara's guidance, the humans began to turn the tide. One particularly daring plan involved luring the Varn into a trap using fake supply convoys as bait. When the aliens attacked, they walked right into a coordinated ambush that decimated their forces. It was a turning point in the war, a moment that shifted momentum firmly in humanity's favor. As the colonies celebrated their success, Clara slipped away, retreating to the solitude of the archives. She didn't need recognition or applause. All she wanted was to know that her work mattered, that she had made a difference, however small. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had. The colony of New Haven buzzed with newfound energy. For the first time in months, there was hope in the air, a fragile, cautious optimism that things might actually turn around. The humans had begun to win battles instead of losing them, and while the war was far from over, the tide was shifting. Soldiers walked taller. Civilians dared to smile again, and even Colonel Jameson seemed less burdened by the weight of command. But behind the scenes, tensions were brewing. Everyone wanted to know who had written a guide to victory. The manual had become a legend, whispered about in mess halls and barracks. It wasn't just a set of strategies. It was a symbol of resilience, proof that humanity still had a fighting chance. Yet its author remained a mystery, and the lack of answers gnawed at people's curiosity. Lieutenant Daniel Harper found himself caught in the middle of it all. He had promised Clara Hayes that he would keep her secret safe, but the pressure was mounting. Officers demanded explanations, and Colonel Jameson had launched an official investigation to uncover the truth. Rumors spread like wildfire, each one wilder than the last. Some claimed the manual was written by a rogue AI analyzing centuries of military history. Others believed it came from an anonymous genius on Earth, secretly guiding the colony from afar. A few even speculated it might be a trap set by the Varn themselves, designed to lure humanity into false confidence. Daniel did his best to deflect attention away from Clara. Whenever someone asked him directly, he shrugged and said, "I don't know any more than you do." But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. Clara's quiet contributions during strategy sessions hadn't gone completely unnoticed. Though she tried to stay in the background, her insights were too sharp, too precise to be ignored. People began to wonder, who is this shadowy figure helping us win? Clara felt the walls closing in around her. She had always preferred staying out of the spotlight, but now it felt like everyone was watching her. Her co-workers in the archives exchanged meaningful glances whenever she passed by. Soldiers nodded respectfully when they saw her, though they didn't say anything outright. Even Colonel Jameson gave her longer looks during meetings, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. One evening, as Clara worked late in the archives, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Lieutenant Rachel Meyer standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and a curious expression on her face. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, forcing a polite smile. Rachel stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I need to ask you something," she said bluntly, "and I want you to tell me the truth." Clara's stomach tightened. "What is it? You wrote the manual, didn't you?" Rachel asked, her voice low but firm. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her mouth to deny it, but Rachel held up a hand. "Don't bother lying. I've seen the way you think. You notice things no one else does. And those ideas you shared during meetings, they match the manual perfectly." For a moment, Clara considered denying it anyway, but something in Rachel's tone told her it wouldn't work. Instead, she sighed and looked down at the floor. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I wrote it." Rachel stared at her, clearly stunned. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "I knew it," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're incredible, you know that?" Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. "I just wanted to help," she mumbled. "Well, you've done more than help," Rachel replied. "You've saved lives, changed the course of this war. But why didn't you come forward sooner? Why hide it?" "Because no one would have listened," Clara said simply. "I'm not a soldier or a strategist. I'm just me." Rachel frowned, her expression softening. "That's ridiculous. Talent doesn't care about titles, Clara. What you've done here, what you're doing, it's extraordinary. You deserve recognition." Clara shook her head quickly. "No, please. I don't want anyone to know. I just want to keep working quietly. That's all." Rachel studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, your secret's safe with me, for now. But mark my words, people will find out eventually. And when they do, they'll realize what we've known all along. You're a hero." After Rachel left, Clara sat alone in the dim light of the archives, her mind racing. She knew Rachel was right. Her secret couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone else would put the pieces together. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a strange sense of resolve. If she was going to be discovered, she decided she would face it on her own terms. Days turned into weeks, and Clara continued to contribute to the war effort, her role growing more prominent despite her efforts to remain anonymous. Under her guidance, the humans executed a series of daring operations that pushed the Varn back further and further. Ambushes became less frequent, supply lines stabilized, and morale soared. The colonies celebrated each victory as a step closer to freedom. Colonel Jameson, however, remained suspicious. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone within the ranks was pulling strings behind the scenes. During one particularly heated meeting, he slammed his fist on the table and demanded answers. "Whoever is feeding us these strategies needs to step forward," he barked. "This isn't a game. We're in the middle of a war." Daniel exchanged a glance with Rachel, both of them knowing exactly who the colonel was talking about. Neither spoke up, though. They had made a promise to Clara, and they intended to keep it. But secrets have a way of unraveling, especially under pressure. One evening, as Clara was leaving the administrative building, she was confronted by none other than Colonel Jameson himself. His piercing gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, she thought her heart might stop. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice cold and measured, "we need to talk." Clara swallowed hard but nodded. "Yes, sir." Jameson led her to his office, where he closed the door firmly behind them. He gestured for her to sit, then leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "I'll get straight to the point," he began. "I know you wrote the manual." Clara's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to protest, but Jameson raised a hand to silence her. "Don't bother denying it. I've pieced it together. The patterns, the strategies, all of it points back to you. So why don't you explain yourself? Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. I wrote it because I wanted to help, she said finally. I saw how we were losing, and I thought maybe I could make a difference. Jameson stared at her, his expression unreadable. Do you realize what you've done? He asked. Your ideas have turned this war around. We're winning because of you. I didn't do it alone, Clara replied softly. Everyone has played a part. Jameson nodded slowly, his anger giving way to something resembling respect. You're right. This victory belongs to all of us. But you're the reason we're still standing. And whether you like it or not, people need to know that. Clara hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. She knew there was no point in fighting it anymore. If the colony needed a hero, she would step up, even if it terrified her. The next morning, Colonel Jameson called an assembly. Soldiers, officers, and civilians gathered in the main square, eager to hear what he had to say. When Clara walked onto the stage beside him, murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one expected to see her there. People of New Haven, Jameson began, his voice carrying across the square. We stand here today because of courage, determination, and ingenuity. But most of all, we stand here because of one person, Miss Clara Hayes. The crowd erupted into cheers as Clara stood silently, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She hadn't wanted this moment, but as she looked out at the faces of the people she had helped save, she felt a flicker of pride. Maybe being seen wasn't so bad after all. From that day forward, Clara's role changed. She became an official advisor to the military, her expertise valued and respected. Though she still preferred to work quietly, she embraced her new responsibilities, knowing that her contributions mattered more than ever. And as the war continued, Clara reminded herself of one simple truth. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest messages. The war ended not with a single dramatic battle, but with a slow, steady grind toward victory. The humans of New Haven, armed with Clara Hayes strategies and fueled by renewed determination, pushed the Varn back until they could push no further. One by one, the alien forces withdrew from contested territories, retreating to their own enclaves far beyond human reach. It wasn't a total annihilation. It never would be, but it was enough. For the first time in years, the colony could breathe easy. Life began to return to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such a long and devastating conflict. Soldiers who had spent months in trenches or on patrol now found themselves rebuilding homes, planting crops, and reconnecting with families they barely remembered. Civilians emerged from bunkers and shelters, blinking in the sunlight, eager to reclaim the lives they had nearly lost. The air buzzed with laughter, music, and the sounds of hammers striking nails as the colony repaired itself piece by piece. But amidst the celebrations, Clara Hayes remained quietly in the background. She hadn't sought fame or recognition when she wrote a guide to victory, and she certainly didn't crave it now. To her relief, most people quickly moved on from the mystery of the manual's authorship, focusing instead on the future. Life was too short, too precious, to dwell on the past. Still, Clara couldn't escape entirely. Her name had been etched into history, whether she liked it or not. Copies of her manual were distributed across colonies, studied by officers and recruits alike. Military academies incorporated its lessons into their training programs, ensuring that future generations would benefit from her insights. Even Earth took notice, with news outlets hailing her as a hero who had turned the tide of an impossible war. Despite all this, Clara chose to stay in New Haven. She returned to her work in the archives, content to fade back into obscurity. The quiet rhythm of cataloging reports and organizing files suited her perfectly. She didn't need applause or medals. She just wanted to keep doing what she loved. Her decision baffled some people. Why stay here? Lieutenant Daniel Harper asked her one day during a rare moment of privacy. You've earned the right to go anywhere, do anything. Why not take advantage of it? Clara smiled faintly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Because this is where I belong, she said simply. This place, these people, they're my home. Besides, someone has to keep track of all those reports. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Only you would turn down glory for paperwork. It's not about the paperwork, Clara replied. It's about making sure no one forgets what happened here, what we learned. If we don't remember, we'll make the same mistakes again. Years passed, and life on New Haven continued to improve. The scars of war remained, abandoned outposts, overgrown fields, and empty spaces where buildings once stood. But they serve as reminders rather than burdens. The colony thrived, growing stronger with each passing season. Children played in streets that had once been battlegrounds, blissfully unaware of the sacrifices made to ensure their safety. One evening, many years after the war ended, a young woman named Emma wandered into the colony's library. She was new to New Haven, having arrived with her family just weeks earlier. Curious about the colony's history, she browsed the shelves, searching for something interesting to read. Her fingers brushed against a dusty old book tucked away in a corner. Pulling it free, she examined the worn cover, a guide to victory. Intrigued, she flipped it open and began to read. Page after page, she absorbed the wisdom within, marveling at the clarity and foresight of an author. By the time she finished, tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Emma carried the book to the front desk, where an elderly librarian sat sorting through a pile of papers. "Excuse me," Emma said, holding up the manual. "Do you know who wrote this? There's no name inside." The librarian looked up, her wrinkled face breaking into a knowing smile. "Ah, yes, that was written by Clara Hayes." "Clara Hayes?" Emma repeated, stunned. "I've heard stories about her. Was she really the one who helped in the war?" The librarian nodded. She was quiet and unassuming, but brilliant all the same. Still works here, believe it or not. You can find her in the archives if you're interested. Emma thanked the librarian and hurried off, clutching the book tightly. She made her way to the archives, her heart racing with anticipation. When she stepped inside, she saw a frail but sharp-eyed woman sitting at a desk, surrounded by stacks of documents. It was Clara. "Miss Hayes?" Emma ventured hesitantly. Clara looked up, surprised to see a visitor. "Yes. I just want to thank you," Emma said, holding out the manual, "for writing this. It's amazing, inspiring." Clara blinked, momentarily taken aback. Then she smiled softly. "You're welcome," she said, "though I didn't write it for thanks. I wrote it because it needed to be done." Emma shook her head, refusing to let the moment pass without saying more. "It's changed everything, not just for us, but for everyone. People talk about you like you're a legend, like you're untouchable." Clara laughed softly, the sound warm and gentle. "I'm not a legend, dear. Just a person who did what she could with what she had. Don't put me on a pedestal. I'm happier down here, working quietly." Emma nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "Even so, your work will live on. It already has. I want to follow in your footsteps, to make a difference, like you did." Clara studied the young woman for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "If you truly want to make a difference," she said finally, "start by listening. Pay attention to the details others overlook. Trust yourself, even when no one else does. And never stop asking questions." Emma promised to remember those words, and as she left the archives, she felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Clara Hayes' legacy would endure, not just in books and battles, but in the hearts of those inspired to carry the torch. Back at her desk, Clara watched Emma go, a small smile playing on her lips. She had never sought greatness, but somehow it had found her anyway. And while she still preferred the shadows to the spotlight, she couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her voice, her quiet, steady voice, had reached farther than she ever imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the colony, Clara returned to her work. The world around her had changed, but she remained the same, steadfast, humble, and unwavering in her dedication to making things better one small step at a time. Because sometimes the quietest voices leave the deepest marks.